For 40 years, I kept this house. Then she said, "You're no longer needed here."
When my daughter-in-law told me, "You're no longer needed here," I folded the linen and smiled, but inside something in me unstitched. How do you hold a life together when the people you built it for decide you are no longer part of the pattern? If you like these stories, please subscribe to Soulbyte YouTube channel. It helps us share more. I had always thought of my home as a slow kind of harbor, steady walls, a kettle that always sang, and a porch light I left on in winter. For 40 years, I raised this family, school lunches, broken bicycles, nights of watching little chests rise and fall. I did the quiet, ordinary things that make a house livable, folded shirts by color, labeled jars in the pantry, learned every crease of the curtains. Those small tasks were never glamorous, but they were how I showed love. My husband and I rented a modest house in a tidy neighborhood. We weren't wealthy, we were careful. I clipped coupons, tracked the pennies in a receipt binder, and learned to make a casserole that could feed a crowd on a Tuesday. My husband worked long days, and I kept things running on the margins: doctor appointments, PTA calls, the tax forms that made my palms sweat. I was the one who knew where the flashlight lived and which shelf the spare light bulbs were on. People called me practical. I took it as a compliment. Our son Michael grew into a warm, dutiful man who still liked his coffee black and his mysteries quiet. He called me when he had big news, and sometimes when he had small doubts. When he met Jenna, I liked her at first, confident, efficient, a planner who liked lists as much as I did. She moved in after the wedding, and together they built a life that from the outside looked tidy and whole. They bought small things on sale, they argued about decorating, they both loved their houseplants. Still, there were little shifts I didn't notice at once. They began arriving for Sunday dinners less often. When they did come, Jenna would sit at her phone between courses, eyes dipping down to a screen more often than to the conversation at the table. Once, I kept a casserole longer than usual because traffic delayed them. Jenna frowned and said, "We could have just eaten at home." The frown made me uneasy, but I told myself I was imagining pride where none was needed. We had a system. I kept the old family photo albums on the third shelf, dusted and labeled. Michael kept us laughing with his dry remarks. Over time, I learned that being useful in a family meant showing up with casseroles and an open calendar. That usefulness felt like a safe citizenship. I belonged because I filled roles nobody else did. That belief made the wound deeper when it happened, the moment when usefulness was declared optional. It began with small slights that, in isolation, I could dismiss, but stacked together they formed a pattern. The first clear cut came on a humid July afternoon. Michael and Jenna visited with a box of takeout, and Jenna asked about my grocery list as if she were checking inventory. I gave her a paper with the staples I liked. She scanned it, said, "You could save yourself a trip, I'll order it online," and then, without looking at me, turned to Michael and whispered, "We'll manage this." It was the tone that stung. The way "we'll manage" suggested I could be managed out. A few months later, my name was left off an email chain about an upcoming family meeting. The meeting was short and ordinary, plans for a small anniversary dinner. I only found out when a cousin texted me, "Are you coming?" I called Michael, voice steady, and he apologized. "I thought Jenna added you," he said. "I'm sorry, Mom." I accepted the apology because I wanted to believe it was an accident. Then came sharper cuts. I discovered, in a moment I can still see, that the spare set of keys I had kept for 30 years now sat untouched in a drawer. Our routines changed. My laundry was no longer folded in the neat stacks on the spare bedroom shelf. Instead, I found a pile of plastic bags with things labeled "donate" and "discard." They piled notes on top of the dresser, notes that started with, "We've decided," and ended with logistical instructions that assumed I would comply. One evening in winter, I knocked on their door after I had stayed late at church arranging flowers. I was carrying lemon bars. When they opened the door, I was greeted by silence. Jenna said, "We're busy." I stood there with the lemon bars cooling on a paper plate, and they closed the door without the usual hug, without the "come in, Mom." I went home and put the plate in the freezer. The next day, I ate a lemon bar and tried not to let the quiet at their doorstep become a verdict. The inciting betrayal arrived on a weekday in the living room where I kept my favorite chair. It was an ordinary conversation turned public and sharp. Michael had invited me over to help organize a box of old bills and records, something I had done for them for years. We sat on the floor with the box between us, while Jenna looked through a pamphlet and scrolled her phone. "You don't need to be doing this anymore," Jenna said, not unkindly, but with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. "We have everything digital now, we've set up accounts." She swept the room with a decisive gesture as if clearing away old furniture. I swallowed. "I've always done these," I said. "It's how I know what's what." "You're welcome to do what you like, but you're not needed here," she repeated, louder now, and a neighbor passing by through the window glanced in, making the whole thing feel public. Michael looked down at his hands and did not meet my eyes. The sentence landed like a closed door. I remember a sharp cold at my wrists where I clutched a stack of envelopes. The anger rose hot and immediate, but I held it down. That was the turning sentence, the line that turned helpful behavior into dispensability. The betrayal was not dramatic in the way of knives or shouting. It was quieter and perhaps more wounding for that reason. Being told you are no longer needed is a small death repeated. Your role, your presence, your daily worth all recede in a single clipped phrase. After that day, the pressure grew like steam in a kettle. It hissed and became loud and inescapable. The first escalation was social. I found myself excluded from plans I once orchestrated: a baby shower for a neighbor they had suggested I host, a family trip where they didn't want the hassle. I learned about many gatherings secondhand through pictures posted online. In those photos, I searched for faces I knew and for any sign that I might have been mentioned. Often there was none. The sting of being reduced to the status of a bystander in your own family is odd. You still know the inside jokes and the names of childhood pets, but your custody of the history no longer matters. Financial shifts came next. I had always handled some of the bills, the cash envelopes for household expenses, the envelope with birthday money for grandchildren. One day I opened the mailbox and found letters addressed to resident with account numbers I didn't recognize. When I asked about them, Jenna said, "We're consolidating things, it's easier." The word easier became a weapon. It excused every change and shrugged off my sense of being left out. I began finding receipts for services I was not told about and statements for memberships I had never used. These were small numbers on paper, amounts I could pay, but the point wasn't money. It was the gradual erasure of my involvement in decisions that for decades had been my small, steady task. There were private costs, too. I lost the quiet rituals that once stitched my days together. I could no longer assume a cup of tea at 3 because someone might be offended that I drank the last tea bag. Meals changed. I learned that certain foods I always kept were no longer welcome. I missed the simple act of setting a place at the table, the chore of sweeping the porch, the sound of the radio playing old songs while I ironed. Those missing acts were like unmade beds. People who slept there could still do it, but someone else had to. I wrote lists and then tore them up. I kept receipts in a shoebox because that's what I had always done, and when the shoebox was moved without my knowledge, it felt like a small theft. The social isolation compounded the emotional weight. I caught myself measuring time by their messages, when they would respond, whether a call would come. The phone became a metronome of hope and disappointment. Once, after a long silence, Michael called and said, "We're busy this Sunday." I managed to say, "Okay," though my throat closed. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table with the mug cold beside me and tried to breathe. There were nights when I worried myself awake, cataloging grievances into lists like recipes. The lists kept me functional, they were practical, but also a kind of lonely catalog of loss. I thought about moving out, about the practicalities of downsizing, but I also remember that home is not just brick and wood and the pattern of curtains. Home is the history you carry in the way you fold a towel. Leaving felt like discarding entire years. At a certain point, the pressure revealed something else, a door slightly ajar that led to a truth I had not suspected. That is the midpoint reveal that changed everything. I found the shift by accident. I was helping Michael with an old photo album in the attic when my hand knocked against a small wooden box tucked behind the insulation. Inside were papers, a certificate of ownership for the house, a deed with my husband's name and my name on it, and tucked between them, a folder with account statements I had never seen. The statements showed that years earlier, during a time when my husband had been ill, I had quietly saved money from odd jobs and gifts and placed them into an account labeled Household Reserve. I had assumed those dollars were small and symbolic. The papers showed they had grown more than I imagined. The discovery rewrote a portion of my power. The reserve wasn't hidden as an act of secrecy, it was an act of care, of making sure there would always be a cushion for strict months. Seeing my name on the deed and the account in my handwriting made me realize I had more agency than I had been allowed to feel. For a long afternoon, the attic dust in the sunlight felt like a kind of baptism. I sat with the papers and let the old, practical part of me wake up. That reveal changed my internal script. Up until then, I had been responding, reacting to slights and exclusions. The discovery let me plan with dignity rather than fury. I didn't shout. I didn't gather allies to complain. I composed myself and began a quiet countermove. My plan was simple, lawful, and measured. It was the kind of plan an older woman who had learned to manage a household would make. I gathered documents. I called a trusted neighbor who had known our family for years, and I made an appointment at the town's records office just to confirm what I had found. I wrote down dates and names in a new notebook with a blue cover and a ribbon marker. I made a list of priorities: to secure the house documents, to ensure my access to the reserve, and to speak with Michael calmly and at length. I took time to steady myself before speaking. There is power in choosing the time and place to say things that matter. When I spoke with Michael, I invited him to sit at the kitchen table over tea. I found some papers, I said, and set the deed and the statements between us. He put his hands flat on the table and looked surprised, and then, for the first time in many weeks, a softness returned to his face. I didn't think of hiding anything, I said. I saved because I worried. It was to make sure the roof stays over our heads if something happened. He swallowed. Mom, he began, and then hesitated. I kept my voice steady. I want to be treated with respect, Michael. I want to be included in decisions that affect this house and our family life. I'm not asking to run things, only to be heard. It was a dignified demand, not a threat. I gave him space to respond. He admitted he hadn't realized how much I had done, that Jenna had been pushing for efficiencies that made sense to her, but also left people like me feeling obsolete. He said he was sorry. The apology was not a magic eraser, but it opened a door to conversation. I also moved quietly to protect my independence. I contacted a local accountant to help me understand the reserve account structure. I asked a neighbor to witness paperwork if needed. I set up appointments for things I had avoided, updating my contact information with the bank, ensuring the deed was in a safe place with certified copies. None of it felt grand. It felt like practical steps a person takes when they decide they will not be erased. I was careful not to weaponize the discovery. I did not brandish the paperwork at family gatherings. Instead, I used it as a foundation for calmer negotiations, to ask for a voice at the table, for respect for ordinary roles like mine, and for clear boundaries around decisions that affected our shared home. I think dignity is often quiet. It does not require fanfare. It requires clear action and steady speech. The public moment when consequences landed, the climax, arrived at a small, community gathering at the church hall. The church was hosting a modest potluck and a presentation about neighborhood safety. Jenna and Michael were there. I had been invited to help set up chairs because that had always been my role. I arrived early and arranged chairs in neat rows the way I had done for decades. As more people came in, conversation began to buzz. Neighbors, old friends, people who had known our family since the children were small. During the event, a minor emergency came up, a power outage in the kitchen that meant the food would get cold, and the hall needed someone to coordinate. Jenna started to speak up, but she was busy with a phone call. I stepped forward and offered to organize the food into coolers and to coordinate the volunteers. People smiled, relieved. Some of the other women who had once relied on me looked at me with recognition in their eyes. After the meeting, a neighbor approached me and said, "We missed your hands at these things." It was a small affirmation, but it felt larger than the room. Jenna, watching from across the hall, met my gaze. There was a moment, a simple exchange of eyes that carried the weight of our months. She came over, and the way she approached this time was different. She said, "Thank you," and added, more quietly, "I didn't know how much you did." I replied, "I've always done what I could." I did not seek a scene. I had no desire to humiliate or shame. The public recognition was enough. People who had once dismissed the value of small acts now saw their usefulness in a practical way. The food was saved, the hall was arranged, the event could go on. My presence mattered in that ordinary, undeniable way. That moment did not dissolve the tensions in one breath. Michael and Jenna still had their ways of living and making decisions. But the consequence of my composed insistence was practical. I had re-established my role in the community and reminded them of the value of the small things I did. It forced a recalibration. They could no longer easily declare me unnecessary without seeing the effect in plain view. After the climax, life rearranged itself into a new, steadier orbit. The resolution was not dramatic. It was a series of small reconciliations and firm boundaries. Michael began to call more often, and when he did, he asked about the details of the household with genuine curiosity. Jenna made an effort to include me in the email chain for family events. Sometimes she asked for my advice about a recipe or seating plan. Sometimes she listened. I did not take every olive branch. I refused one attempt to sweep the reserve into an account I did not authorize. I stood my ground with a gentle firmness. Boundaries are the quiet scaffolding of respect. We settled into new rhythms. I stopped expecting others to notice every small thing I did, and I found places outside the family where my work was seen. I started volunteering twice a month at the community center, arranging activities for seniors. It filled my days and reminded me that usefulness need not be confined to one household. Friends came over for tea on Thursdays, and we talked about politics and recipes and the weather. I found joy that had nothing to do with being needed by one household. There were also acts of grace. One afternoon, Jenna brought over a box of her mother's old recipe cards. She had found them while cleaning and thought I might like to add them to my binder. "I thought you'd appreciate these," she said. I felt a small warmth, and I accepted them with a nod. It was not a cure, but a gesture, and gestures count. The moral of this real-life story for me was that dignity can be practical and quiet. You do not always need a dramatic showdown to be seen. There is enormous power in knowing your papers are in order, in choosing the time to speak, and in stepping forward calmly when a need arises. Betrayal hurt, and it changed me, but it did not break me. I learned that belonging is not only earned by usefulness, but also protected by clear, steady boundaries. If there is a lesson I would share with anyone listening to this family drama, it is this: keep your receipts, literally and metaphorically. Keep the small records that remind you of your life's work. Keep your friends close and your documents closer. Pride can make us hold on too long to what hurts. Practicality gives us tools to shape better days. My final act in that chapter of my life was simple. On a rainy morning, I polished the brass mail slot and lit a candle in the window. I made a list of things I loved to do and ways I could still contribute to the people around me without losing myself. I called my sister and told her about the new volunteer schedule. I made lemon bars on a Wednesday afternoon and left a pan at Michael's door with a note that said, "Made enough for two." He texted back, "Thanks, Mom. Come over Sunday." I paused and then wrote, "I'll be there at 3." I sat for a moment after sending the message and looked out at the garden. The curtains moved in a small, steady draft. The house I had helped keep for 40 years still stood. The day had its ordinary weather, and I felt, not triumphant, but steady. If you found this emotional story meaningful, please like and share it. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt quietly edged out of a place you loved. Your voice matters here. If you like these stories, please subscribe to Soulbyte for more real-life stories and gentle reflections.